Welcome, actually, I do not speak English, because this is an English-speaking event, given that the main speaker of today is actually English-speaking and not Dutch. So welcome to the campus, and hij is een hele faculty club of Radboud University Nijmegen. Thank you for joining us in such large numbers. We're quite pleased with that. We're basically fully booked. Some more people will probably arrive, so maybe we get a slight shortage of chairs. So please bear with me there. I won't give very much of an introduction. Also, I will not, in many words, introduce the speakers, because my experience is that the speakers can much better introduce themselves than I could possibly do. I will just cut things short by saying I wish you a very pleasant afternoon, a very instructive and interesting afternoon. And I'll carry on with doing the opening content-wise, for which I'll actually hand back this thing. So, theme of today, creating the enterprise, engineering or emergence. Creating the enterprise, of course, has many aspects. I'm sure I don't have to tell you there. There's some more people arriving. Obviously, we're talking about a blend of business and IT here. And also, obviously, this can be done from an engineering perspective, which is usual for our branch. But there's more there. So what's this emergence stuff? Some people actually thought it was about emergencies. It's not the case. However, maybe it is. In many cases, there's a clear link. So what we have is, straight from a dictionary, the process of coming into being or becoming important or prominent. Very often things that are emergent are there before you notice them. In any case, they just seem to happen. And then the question is how to deal with them very often. The connotation, the very blunt connotation I want to throw in here is that for us it usually means, in a practical sense, not being artificially kicked into being all at once. As for the emergent organization, we can say, let there be this and this and this organization. And then very often this does not transpire that easily. Things just happen in organizations. And sometimes that's something we think is okay, sometimes it's something we don't like, but it's there, and how can we cope with it? For me, that's the main intuitive theme of today. Now, for a bit of Eastern philosophy, but not really. The guy in the corner there, Leo Hermans, who's not among us anymore, once taught me about these things, and it's something from Taoist and Zen philosophy, but never mind that. Because I think it's an intuitive thing as well, that you can say, okay, you've got Wei, which is designing, deliberately, at least for a large part, rationally designing, and then you have letting grow, which sounds very soft, but it has certainly something to do with emergence. Right. Another way of expressing it is active making versus passive making. Actually, the circle is the Taoist calligraphy sign for Wu Wei, which is letting grow. It's passive emergence. Now, important thing is that if you really take a sort of a new age perspective to things, then you might say that letting grow is always better, but that things just do not work that way. Hardly ever, not in our real, like in our society. So, as Leo always pointed out, it's not the one or the other, not that Wu Wei letting grow is superior. No, it's about the combination of the two. Sometimes, for example, if you build a bridge, then a controlled design is actually fine. There may be some tweaking to do, and maybe someone doesn't like the color after 20 years, but basically you can think things up, design them, write them down, draw them, build them. Right, it's not so hard. For organizations, this turns out slightly different, but I won't go into that. That's for the gentleman over there. The other side of things, the one that's difficult and we want to think about a bit, is the letting grow part. And then there's the small seedling there, which is clearly a symbol of letting grow. But then there's also the bonsai tree, and I put that in. And Erik, when he saw the slide yesterday, immediately responded, yeah, but bonsai, that's not freely letting grow, is it? It's actually a very controlled, extremely patient, slow process, but very carefully guiding the tree. Well, yes, exactly. Exactly. So, these are a few questions I throw up, not in the literal sense, by the way. I throw up in the air. These are some things that we might consider. Mark you. I mean, I haven't forced these questions down the gentleman's throat, and I haven't asked them to explicitly answer all of these. These are the things I just throw at you now. I'll just read them out for auditory learning. Where do organizations come from? From, well, there's not a stork bringing them. Where do they start? What's an organization? And what is not? What is organization anyway? That's something that Jim has done a lot of work on, which to me has been important, and to many other people as well. Can there be such a thing as organizational design? Well, I suppose most of you will say, yeah, probably yes, but then, where's the emergent factor, and can we let emergence happen in a controlled way? Or is emergence something we can you just have to cope with, but at least it's there in most of the cases? And then the million-dollar question, how can we effectively blend design and emergence? Or to put it differently, how can we cope with emergence? How can we deal with emergence? So if we can let that sing around in our heads and our conversations this afternoon and come out a bit wiser in the end, I'll be a very happy man. Okay, so let's move on to the first speaker, Erik Proper. Please come up. We'll arrange this so that it works, I hope. And like I said, I'll leave the introductory stuff to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a story of 4 E's: engineering, emergence, and enterprises, and I'm basing that on some experiences, the work we've done in the past. It's also a bit reflective in the sense that my goal is not to present the solution. My goal is to come up with some questions and issues. Thank you. Yeah, I told him I move around a lot, so I like to be able to move. So the idea is to pose a number of questions and maybe then also lead into discussions later on. Looking back at some of the things that I myself, other people worked on in the past, and also look at some challenges that are upon us and maybe some directions that might guide us in finding a solution. So, but first a little bit about where I'm from. I'm originally from Tudor University, where I still partially lead a team of researchers working on enterprise engineering related topics and modeling related topics. But my main base nowadays is in Tudor, which is a research organization based in Luxembourg. Most of you will know the TNO organization in the Netherlands, and Tudor is a similar organization. It's another organization, but it's a similar organization to what we call TNO in the Netherlands, and it's publicly funded, and we do research there in the fields of service innovation, but also enterprise engineering and enterprise architecture. And because I'm leading really a team involving people at that institute, and also in Nijmegen, also involving a number of practice and PhD students, so people who work in industry and still are also enrolled in a PhD, we created a bit of an umbrella called the Enterprise Engineering Team that brings together these teams, and we try to do research and on this area, exchange ideas, and develop a further understanding. Now, in preparing this presentation, I started out from this notion that enterprises change. Emergence, yes, this is performance change, We engineer deliberate change, so enterprises change. And that led me to go back to an old thesis that's on my bookshelf, and I found an interesting quote in there. It says something like, nowadays the financial prosperity of an organization depends increasingly on its ability to change. So change has really become a primary process. It has to be managed just as well as any normal production process, because if you don't, then you can't change. Flexibility, nowadays we use the keyword agility, whatever keyword bingo you like. Flexibility allows an organization to be more competitive in the global market, thus improving its chances of survival. It's just actual as 20 years ago, close to 20 years ago when this was written. This means that the organization must be able to adapt quickly to producing new or different products. Change in the primary process of an organization that results from every higher changing consumer needs, etc. Okay, that still, I think, is sensible, and there we are. It's actually my PhD, close to 20 years old. But I found another very interesting quote in there, and it's a quote of the quote. It's much more interesting. There's this one. There's a theory which states that if ever anyone discovers exactly what the universe is for and why it's there, it will instantly disappear and be replaced with something even more bizarre and inexplicable. I thought it was cute to add this quote in my PhD. But looking back, the funny thing is that this has happened a few times in the way the things we produce in our research. So we're still trying to find the theory, and still haven't found it, but probably going to continue a while longer. It's going to be a while before I can retire or want to retire, if ever at all, but we're going to continue. But if you indeed look at the past, things we have worked on and I've been involved in, going from some initial ideas people around me had when I worked at Origin. It was then called Origin, it's now called Origin again, I believe, but it was called Origin at that stage. That was my first landing in industry. Later on, we looked at migrations, large-scale migrations, how that would work from a project point of view. That led indirectly to the birth of the idea of having the Archimate project, so the two right top books. And then turning around the corner, we started to looking at the value of why do we produce all these models, why bother. So that's why we, at that stage, interacting between the University of Nijmegen and Capgemini, we come up with this book about looking at enterprise architecture as a means for informed governance, informed decision making. And one of the instruments, key instruments in architecture, in our understanding at that point in time, was that it's really about principles. Architecture principles, so that led to the architecture principles book. And later, a book that is about to come out now, that's based on the Agile Service Development Project, where we concluded that really we need to look more also at the agility of things. Architecture has a tendency, if you're not careful, to really be the ultimate big design up front attitude, whereas a lot of things can be said if you balance agility and thinking about the future. So that's a bit of an evolution in the sense that each time we kept on refining that, and in my presentation I'm looking back at some of those conclusions and also trying to push things a little bit further. So that should be structure. No, not yet, sorry. I inserted a slide, I forgot about that. Of course, all these ideas are not my own ideas. I've, in the course of years, also in developing these rooms, we have had interaction with a lot of people, just a lot of names, and hopefully I hope to learn a bit more today as well. A lot of people that I and people around me worked with, and we can inspire. So it also clearly suggests that this type of research is very much a team effort. And also requires, if you look at the names and know where someone from, requires a tight interaction between theory and practice, between researchers and between practitioners. And if you look at my own past, you can see that I've been hopping between industry and academia a few times. And I really think that for this kind of work we need both people that, we need to engage both people that are more on the fundamental side and more on the applied science, and get a lot of interesting insight. So engage. You shouldn't just say that is it not theory based, therefore it's not good. There's a lot of value in a lot of the things that are being produced by people who come up with these ideas and needs from practice. At the same time, you need theoretical and opinion, rigor and relevance. That's, that list also signifies that. Now I'm going to take two takes at the question of engineering and emergence, today's theme. First, I'm going to take a look at the engineering perspective, engineering the enterprise, and then I'm going to shift slightly and talk about engineering for emergence, growing the bonsai tree. Engineering, you can say a lot about that. In the past, people have thought about this, and this sounds like a nice definition to me for engineering, developed by the Engineers Council for Professional Development. Happened to be an American one, but I think this is fairly decent. The creative application, creativity, application of scientific principles, so science-based, to design, develop structures, etc., etc. Forecast their behavior, being able to analyze where we are, forecast the future, under specific operating conditions, all as respects an intended function. So we must know a little bit about the intended function of the object, economics of operation, and safety to life and property. Well, that's a bit of a mission statement, but in the case of engineering enterprises, we can relate to that when we talk about the fact that enterprises primarily contain human beings with a lot of technology. So we must also take a look at the role of the human in there when designing these things. That's engineering, and of course we have been applying this in our field and mirroring this. Of course, these are images from the construction field. Some of you may recognize these images because they generally reappear a lot on slides, if I remember correctly, mainly from Capgemini, but we use them, we as enterprise architects, enterprise engineers, use them to draw this parallel to the physical world. And we immediately know what we mean, in the sense that we talk about zoning plans. And in zoning plans we can already do risk analysis or impact analysis, high level understanding of what might happen. In our world we would position languages like Archimate in that arena. Then we move on to more detailed designs. We design a suburb. We still do that with a language like Archimate. We can also in both cases apply architectural principles in the sense of high level rules that identify statements like we will not have heavy industry next to living suburbs, and each living suburb will have schooling facilities. Or we could say, no, let's integrate offices into the living area, so we don't have these areas that at night are completely desolate. We have this integration. That kind of principles we also have in our field, of course, and you can discuss them and see the impact at these levels. And of course, at the bottom we have the full design, and we would use languages like BPMN or UML to really do nitty-gritty design. Now, that's what we do, we have, and we do so to, what I would say, do deliberate transformations. You could say controlled transformations, planned transformations, but in general the connotations are a little bit tricky, so let's put a new wall in it, let's spoil that one, and now I found the word deliberate, in the sense that it really signifies the fact that it's a deliberate thing. You grow the bonsai tree with a deliberate perspective. It's thought through, but it's not strict. You do it deliberate. And deliberate transformations, first take, very much engineering inspired. We typically do in three streams of activities. Assess the situation, what is needed, the intended function, the intended context. We design the artifact, and then we implement. We have designed the artifact and we implement it. And of course designing involves creativity, so we envision a solution, elaborate the designs, some alternatives, and we pick one that best fits the needs. And of course there's no arrow in here. Yes, it is iterative, it bounces up and down a little bit, but of course before we implement it, it's kind of a good idea to have at least the design finished more or less. more or less. And we use language like these. This happens to be Archimate, but could have been UML, a demo model, BPMN models, depends on what we want to design. And of course these diagrams are way too complicated to talk to real people, so we also create views that are stated in a language that is more appetitable to stakeholders, a spreadsheet or a landscape map that allows us to communicate better with the stakeholders. Good. Well, so far so good, nothing wrong. Well, let's put on the squeezes a little bit. Future changes. Because where's the change in this? Well, what is the expected variety? It's something that clearly popped up in the ASD project, Agile Service Development Project, saying, okay, you talk about agility of services, well, agility of the enterprise. What agility are you expecting? You're selling ice cream? Yeah. What are you going to sell tomorrow? Ice cream. Okay. The day after? Ice cream. Okay. But how are you going to do that? Well, we don't know that. You might want to variate that. Where is your expected variation? What is more likely to change? Your product or the processes you use in creating the product? Or is it actually the process that is stable? We always do the same kind of business process. We have a sales activity, we produce the product, we deliver the product, and the rest depends slightly on the product, what we actually sell to the customer, because we make custom-made clothes or we make custom-made houses. So we have a coarse-grained standardized process, and depending on the specific sales, it's flexible. That's a different perspective. Or the process is pretty much the same, the product is pretty much the same, but the rules we have to apply change, like tax declarations. The taxation department is pretty much each year the same process, pretty much each year the same product, get taxed. And the rules change. So what is really variable? Where's the variety? And you can of course analyze that at a more refined level in terms of, okay, you can look at functionality, does the functionality change over time? The construction, the implementation, in terms of which technologies. So at one point in time, now we can start thinking about the future and decide where do we need variety. And these designs, these alternatives that I'm trying to evaluate, how resilient, how accommodating are these towards these changes. Very much an engineering perspective. And then it really makes sense to focus on the essence, in the sense of, okay, this tax process, what it's really about, what is really stable, what is the essence of such a process. I'm pretty sure that Jan in his presentation will elaborate more on this concept of essence, of identifying what is your organization really about, what's stable in it. And towards maybe construction implementation, towards adding more details, we can indeed use design principles, and as not all people might know principles, these are some examples. So statements like information is captured at the source, IT systems communicate through services, business units communicate through services. Those really give a direction of how to elaborate the design of your organization with impact. I mean, if information is only captured at the source, we typically prevent redundant capturing of information. The organization I work for instance, has the interesting habit of asking information more than once, because it's still very much a silo organization with different administrative entities leading to multiple questions on the same issues. And we all know that, those type of organizations. Information is captured at the source only, really then leads into a very interesting discussion into those organizations about changing that. More challenges. Some of them are trivial, well, not trivial, some of them we have always solved more or less, but I'm working towards a major challenge. So the first one is complex transformations. And there are really two kinds of complexity. First of all, transformation can be big. So we would typically decide, let's chop it up in small projects. And all these small projects claim to, should really contribute to the larger whole. And how do we make sure that that's the case? Well, that's one of the reasons why we have architecture. Because once you've set out what you want to be realized, the direction you want to move, then you can use your architecture to make sure that all the projects are in line. You break it up in smaller parts and make sure that the project stays in line. The other complexity might be that the system that you are changing has a high inherent complexity. But then you can also use architecture to harness that complexity, to get insight into where the complexity is, separate core issues from less important issues, and harness complexity. Well, we more or less have that covered. There's still a lot of work to be done. Now how to best do this, but okay. Another challenge. Meanwhile, while you were doing the transformation, reality changed. During the transformation, you get new insights about the organization, about its environment. During the transformation, there's new legislation. The markets change, the world changes. So that's not nice. We knew that. But yeah, we also have approaches like agile, micro projects. If you look at the standards report from a number of years ago, they already said, well, you shouldn't do these big projects, you should really do a lot of small micro projects. So that each time after a project, you can look up, after the next sprint, you look up, check out anything happened. Yes, some things change, you don't. So it is a challenge, the meanwhile, but we have some ways of dealing with that. And there's still a lot of homework, true. But we get into a bigger challenge. Enterprises, because we are talking about enterprise engineering, we're not talking about engineering a machine anymore. We're talking about engineering a social technical system. Or rather, a technical system with human beings around it. Human beings with culture, with ways of working around problems. Humans that tend to, not always, but tend to resist change. Change of power structure, change of work. Creates uncertainty, creates resistance against change. But already in the 70s, 80s, we found something to help us with that, called change management. All system development projects had a section called change management. So yes, we have the implementation, now we just have to force it into the organization. That works. Well, it's a little bit more advanced than that nowadays, but we do know about change and resistance, but in general, then it becomes change management to deal with that. But it goes a bit further. They changed on their own. And in the 80s, 90s, Stijn looked at a case for his PhD. People already found ways to work around the limits of the information systems. There was this nice comment field you could use to send specific messages or misuse to add additional things for the administration. That wasn't designed in by the designers. That was created by the people who actually do the work. Why? Well, maybe because they are obnoxious, stubborn, or maybe because they know if we don't do this, it won't work. They will make it work. If you have a hammer and you only have screws, you're still going to drive the screws into the wall. Yes, you could imagine a better instrument, but we only have a hammer. Tough luck. It's going to be the screw that's going to get into the wall with the hammer, full stop. You have to work around for that. Or if there's no hammer, I'll probably find a rock to do it. We're humans. We find ways to get things done. And in modern times, example, who of you uses Google Docs? And keep the fingers up. Who uses Dropbox? Who uses these, Google Docs or Dropbox, for daily work? Yeah, still a fair number. That's shadow IT, in the sense of that's IT that is not typically designed in. Because how many of you that use Dropbox at a daily rate was suggested by corporate IT to do so? Yeah, that says enough. It says enough, right? We do. Now look in the business unit who needs new functionality. They're going to turn to the cloud if corporate IT doesn't deliver. They will find a way around the IT stuff. Things will happen, with or without support. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we also have emergence. I mean, first of all, emergence is human. We think about new ideas and development. And in terms of our architecture, be it from an IT or business process perspective, we make things work. We all know, well, excuse me for the non-Dutch speakers, with the concept of stiptheidsactie. What does it essentially mean? Stiptheidsactie means we are going to do this business process as designed. And we do it as a way of striking. It's crazy. So if you play by the rules, things will break down. Yeah, wait a minute. What does that mean? What does that mean for engineering? So, yeah, emergence. Luckily, we have emergence. So then, let's get on to engineering for emergence, because if emergence is something that is there, is good, and sometimes it's bad, how to deal with that for engineering perspective. So again, let's go back to deliberate transformation, and maybe change it a little bit. Maybe we should now talk more about appreciate the things there are, not just the technology, but appreciate the context, appreciate what's happening in terms of processes, understanding what's happening, designing the future situation, and establishing the situation. Let's forget about implementing. Implementing is something we did when we only talked about IT. When we are moving beyond IT towards the enterprise, towards social technical systems, we should not think about implementing anymore. We should abolish that word. It's established for the next 5 minutes. And it stays envision, elaborate. We still need to create ideas, elaborate them, and select them. And of course, it still is not linear. Now let's see what happens with this one. Design. Yes, let's focus on design. Oh, good. That came across. I wrote this on a map. You never know what happens. But the design of what? Because if we design an enterprise, there are a number of things we can design. We can design the operational process. We can design the control processes. We can design how are we producing these ice creams. We're selling ice cream. So how do we do that? How do we produce that? In an operational way, and we have to control the process, that's fine. So we can design the execution capability. Selling ice cream, trading ice cream, selling ice cream. We can design that. That is being designed by, I put it on this slide as innovation capability, but let's say for the moment change capability. It's designed by some capability in the organization that is able to observe the way we do things at the moment, reflect on this, how we could do it better, or how to create a new product. So new products, new processes, improved processes. Think about these and transform the execution capability. So it's like thinking, observing, we're not producing ice creams in an efficient way. How can we do it more efficiently and make it so? Change the execution capability. Or can we come up with a new type of ice cream? We used to sell ice cream through the hospitality services, but now we're going to put them in small boxes and sell them directly to the consumers, small ice creams. That kind of flow. Now we can also design that. We can design the innovation capability. We can design the change capability. And that's very interesting in the sense that if you work in an organization that really aims for operational excellence, to use the Three tripartite view, operational excellence, you really want to design the execution capability really well. If you work in an organization that goes for customer intimacy, you really want to design the execution capability with the client as a central point, a lot of client interaction, a lot of client engagement to get this customer intimacy. But if you're in a company that does a lot of product leadership, that probably means that the execution capability, of course, you need to execute. But the innovation capability, that it must be designed really well, becomes of strategic importance. So if you talk about architecture and engineering, maybe you should then focus more on engineering and innovation capability. Also in organizations that realize that in process improvement, Six Sigma, etc., actually also emerges by people in the execution capability, observing what goes on and reflecting about this. Also in that case, you're redesigning the innovation capability, in this case innovation of your processes, how you do the existing things better. You're really thinking about how to best design the innovation, the process improvement capability. So that's that level. Of course, you could even put up a third level, CMM5. How are we going to improve the innovation capability? Because that can be designed, it has an explicit design. And if you talk about a situation in an organization where you know it makes sense to support, enable, drive emergence in part of the organization, you're probably going to put a lot of effort in creating the innovation capability. As a central unit or decentralized, that's your specific style of doing that. But you are putting effort in designing innovation capability. Be it top-down controlled or be it bottom-up, it's about designing that. And if it's just about operational excellence with a predefined strict structure, then of course you're going to spend a lot more time on the execution capability. So that's the question of what to design. And then comes the question of what happens during the transformation, what to transform, leading feedback onto the question of what to design. Traditionally, and take a look at the contemporary approaches, TOGAF, unified process. Most approaches that I know about take the perspective that I have an existing situation as is, east, and articulate some future state where you would like to be. The target architecture, the soul situation, where do you want to be? Now, I would agree to that works very well for technical systems, because you can implement them. But those systems that have the habit of changing themselves are a bit more difficult. They don't stay where they are. They're not a state. They're a moving target. They move. They already changed. If we agree that we look not just at IT anymore, but we start to look at enterprises, we have to take into account that they evolve out of themselves. Whether or not we do engineering, it changes. And it also does so while we do the engineering. So it's a vector. Not whether you use the directional, it changes itself, of course, as well. It changes. People start using Dropbox. Oh, gee, that wasn't engineering. Which really means that if you want to change that, we should think about changing the direction of that vector. It changes. And is it changing in the direction we like? If it does, don't bother. No intervention needed. Is there anyone here who rides horseback riding? Western style or English? Western. What I've learned about Western style riding is that if the horse is moving in the right direction, you don't do anything, you just sit. If you want to change direction, you intervene. As soon as the horse changes direction, you slack off again. You don't put continuous pressure on it like the English style horse riding does. It's the engineering style. All time, control, maximum control. As soon as you kick this vector, kick it, and it starts moving, leave it alone again. Of course, you can still monitor. Yeah, you need to do that when you're on a horse. Otherwise, you get accidents. I'm missing one of our postdocs now. He fell off a horse. But the idea is to then create a momentum to get this vector changing. And I think, I mean, if you talk about this to people from management science, they say, "Duh, of course you have to do this. It's intervention." But we, with an IT past, engineering, model-driven IT past, we tend to think about these things in terms of states. Just take a look at all the books. But it's a vector. So we should design the intervention. We should not just design the state. We shouldn't just look at the baseline architecture. We should look at the base vector that's moving out. We shouldn't just say what is the target state. We should talk about what's the desired direction and how do we intervene in the current vector to get it into that direction. We had an interesting discussion about this morning. And I think that design principles and focus on essence can still help, be very helpful in this. Because to get the direction going, it's good to know what is essential in my enterprise. Is that changing, or is just an implementation changing? Is it just a variation on the base theme? Where are we moving? If the change of direction is just about the implementation, it's much easier than if you want to make a fundamental change in terms of the essence. And the same with design principles. So back to deliberate transformation. Appreciate the direction where we're going. Understand where we're going. Appreciate that. Design the intervention and then do an intervention. Not implement, not even just establish, it's intervention. Social science, management science use the term intervention. So we may have to start thinking about that like that.
Good question. Appreciate in one of the previous slides, somewhere in that corner you also said assess. Is that a deliberate change of wording there?
Yeah, a little bit more softer. Okay. Also appreciate in the sense that something you might see is, you might actually look better on if you look at it from an appreciation point of view. But that's actually a good development. Let's actually foster that. I like that way this tree is growing. Let's foster it in that direction. So it becomes more softer terminology. We can still use models.
It's more dynamic and it's more static.
Yeah, we can still use models. And I think really we should use even more models to start seeing the things we need to see. But it takes another perspective. There's not models as designing, but also models as understanding what's going on and putting it in a perspective. What's happening with the emergence? What's happening there? This can stay the same for the moment. So rather than saying engineering versus emergence, I would rather say engineering emergence. If you put more effort on this middle layer of the innovation capability or change capability, finding the best word, that drives the changes of the lower layer and accommodates for emergence, then I think well, that's at least the next thing, the next book I might consider co-working on. I don't like working alone, so I always prefer to work in a team. Maybe because I'm too dumb myself. So that was the story of 4 E's. Any quick questions? If there is time.
10 minutes,
oh, we have 10 minutes. I could have spoken.
I'll leave you in the driver's seat.
Oh yeah, I understand. Any questions?
One first thing that creeps a bit in my mind is predictability. The initial paradigm allows for quite a predictable outcome for the fall bridge. The second paradigm well, doesn't allow for that much of predictability, and that's a tough message to tell to our stakeholders who wants us to perform a transformation. How can we increase the predictability of the outcome in the emerging enterprise?
Mm-hmm. It's a very tough question. And let's start by maybe jointly observing that it's not a good idea to deny if it's not predictable. Because the worst thing we can do is say, let's assume that we don't have emergence and it's nice and cleanly predictable. Then the guys who need our input will always be disappointed. Because that's dangerous.
Maybe I can...
You can answer, yeah?
But when I use emergence in practice, because I do that already several years, then I found out that the question itself, predictability, is an engineering question. So I tried to find out what if I don't use that. Like in some projects I have an approach like seed, breed, bloom. But it can also seed, breed, bleed zijn. It can go in other direction. In some, for example, when some business management does already know the emergence of products in markets who bloom and just give rise to enormous scalability issues and so on. But at the same time, just those products also, but one of them will bloom and the others just get rid of. So they don't need to know the certainties which we want to know in engineering. Just don't assume certainties beforehand. You can anticipate, like knowing the strains in the organizations you are in now. You can anticipate on what direction they go on, and you can intervene, and you can put in mechanisms and so on, but you don't have to know.
But what's interesting there is the question, Mr. Question, to what extent senior management is fundamentally able to deal with emergence. Because they have to relinquish a lot more control, and the MBA taught manager is not trained that way.
Sure.
I would like to say.
And I experienced that especially on the executive and board level, they are much more open for emergent type of thinking, because they already know that the MBA type of engineering enforcement doesn't work.
No.
And the middle management is really the issue.
Yeah. So when we are in a situation where you have control, then you run into this problem. If you go back to this book about architecture as a means for informed governance, then there's a building risk there in the sense of identifying our clients and also the fairness of their need. If our clients, ours as a field, are middle management people, they probably want to have, they probably are seeking control, and if we ask them what do you want from our instrument, they want ultimate control. Whereas we have to separate that from the question whether that's successful at all.
It's the same again here. Like on those projects, I'm very reluctant to use governance models in steering approaches. And instead of that, governance is, by the way, doing it with bosses. That's simply said. I like to have more engagement models. And engagement models is doing it with friends, and meaning collaboration, communities, and all that stuff. And it's completely different from enforcement, competitiveness, individual focus, and so on. Emergence to me is collective focus. Like repeatedly doing the same. Like that's also the mechanisms behind the spaghetti and sourdough landscapes. Repeatedly doing project management and business case makes a sourdough landscape.
Yeah.
And there's no architect who's pressing his breast and saying, I designed that. But we can change that mechanism, the coordination mechanism of business cases, project management, to do other types of steering and so on, like with process ownership and with service ownership. You get all kinds of different anticipated landscapes. But in the meantime, you leave lots of control free. It's kind of a meta-level approach in which design freedom evolves. Like, okay, if I want to have a kind of forest of oaks, I can only put oaks in there. If I want a mixed focus, I just do a mixed type of seeding. But it means that if I seed something, I have to nurture after that. And that nurturing is still going on. And that's the freedom for branches and so on.
That would suggest that towards the future, we could, from an engineering point of view, focus very much on understanding where we are at the moment, how we got there. A lot of things about the future are uncertain. Some aspects are not. At least those aspects which we can predict, we can offer insight. Insight to the community. Insight in the current situation, insight into what future scenarios might bring, but with a lot of humbleness about what we can actually predict, and focus on providing an insight and let the community in full engagement make the decision. So collaboration in terms of these processes and the collaborative aspects of that is also something that we should start taking a look at in terms of these change processes.
Okay, well answered question. Thank you for your contribution. Anything else? Any issue?
I don't know of any language that can describe these changes. Yeah. I know languages that can describe states.
Yeah.
But change from one state to another, I haven't seen any language. Do you know?
No. No, I don't know of a language like that, and yes, it's going to be very interesting research, Tom.
I thought so.
Yeah. It's already kind of interesting to maybe start by looking at the past, in the sense of how can we sensibly describe in a language like Archimate, just as an example, or any other language that really enables state modeling, to model the evolution, how it got to be. If anyone has an interesting case study, report to me, because we're writing a research proposal on this.
You are?
Yes, looking at the past.
Just one little note to remind me of, fulfilling my neutrality in this, but language is notoriously bad at dealing with describing change. Most languages are very much fixed on the static part. Also, science is particularly bad at dealing with describing change. I mean, there's all sorts of nifty things that you come up with, but dynamics is always a problem. I'm not saying that we can't deal at all, but that's always the hard part.
It changes.
You focus a lot on emergence as a single vector. I'm seeking to suggest that emergence is going one way in an organization. But when you look at, say, this university, we have a whole broad range of faculties and we're emerging in 10 directions at once, often conflicting directions. How do you suggest you steer that? So when you say at the start of your presentation, we need to change and we need to be flexible. So if one part of the organization is emerging to the left and the other part is emerging to the right, and the other part is going forward and the other part is going back and the final part is going still, you can either rip your organization into 5 pieces or you can go nowhere at all. How do you steer that kind of emergence?
Yeah.
Conflicting emergence.
Yeah. First of all, I didn't capture that in the arrow, but it's really multiple. That means the direction is into. That would be the direction is into chaos. The core question, of course, is how bad is that? In a sense, how bad is that? How bad is it if one part of the organization moves in that direction and the other part in that direction? How bad is that, and for whom is it bad? Because it might actually be for the people here, people there, it might actually be good. So something or someone must have a higher order goal that would force them together. So in those situations, we first need to assess why do we have to keep it together? And maybe then decide against emergence. Make sure that the bonsai tree cannot grow in a certain direction, but only in the direction you want to. It is a restrictive intervention in terms of freedom, but when is emergence desirable and when not? For the owners of the thing, the enterprise that has these two things that move in a different direction, for the owners, is it nice or not nice to see this and have this? Or maybe the enterprise as such should be dissolved into 2 spin-off companies. That's a decision that senior management of that thing has to make. And it has to relinquish control. Of course, that has to do with the style of management, in the sense of, is it my company, rather than thinking in terms of network organizations. And you do see a move towards network organizations, where it's not clear, is this the Tudor research team or is this a Nijmegen research team? Well, we like to do research together on a similar topic, so let's call ourselves the team. And maybe in 5 years' time, goodbye, it was nice talking to you, may have a few drinks later on. It's a network. It's the network, stupid. I mean, so it depends on the first question, do you want or not control? But if you do want to put control into place, you have to accept the consequence that the social processes of the people involved are going to be disrupted. In the sense of you have to really do some work, some effort to keep them in line, or to lure them in line, because it's much more fun to be together.
Okay, I want to stop with that. So thanks for your contributions. Okay. Next speaker will be Henri. We'll have to change the machines, so it'll take a while anyway. And I would give you the opportunity to have a cemetery stop or something like that, but we'll start again in 5 minutes sharp.